My name is Phil Mardoc. I live in Enfield, Connecticut, but I was actually born in Springfield, Massachusetts. I've never lived there. I've lived in Enfield most of my life. I work at Travelers Insurance Company in Hartford, Connecticut, and I've worked there for almost 29 years. I started photography in high school. I started taking classes in high school in photography, and that was where I first got the bug. I had my dad's Minolta rangefinder camera, and I was shooting black and white 35 millimeter. My dad had his 1940s era very basic darkroom equipment, and I set up a very primitive black and white darkroom in our family's basement, and I would just spend endless hours down there doing photography. And I just loved working in the darkroom, developing, printing, but basic stuff. And because I had a buddy in high school, Todd, and he and I took the photography classes, and we would go out and do photo shoots, just random things, after school or on weekends, and then we would just, develop and print stuff. So I just really enjoyed being in the darkroom, working in the darkroom. I didn't have a favorite, subject. Over the years, unfortunately, I only have a handful of photos, not even those that I took. I don't think, maybe a couple that I took. So I think they have been lost in all the moves and things over time, so that's a shame. I really wish I had the photography from back then. But that was really where where I started developing a photographer's eye for maybe images and composition. But then I went to college. I majored in classical guitar. Through most of college, I had started playing guitar when I was 6 or 7 years old, and my mother's she just had a little, like a parlor guitar, and I used to play that. And when my older sister started playing guitar as a hippie, I used to play her guitar more than she did, and eventually my parents bought me a guitar and got me classical guitar lessons, which is what I wanted. So I don't have a degree in classical guitar, but I had this kind of continuous thread of sort of artistic pursuits from a very early age, but just as a hobby. I never thought of it seriously. I just really enjoyed doing these things. I got married. I had 4 kids, and so for like the next 40 years, I didn't do any artistic photography, just family snapshots. And my kids are grown and gone, and I have time to myself. And I took a adult education class in just basic digital photography, and that's what I started with. I transferred my film knowledge to digital, which wasn't that much to begin with, but that was my springboard. And then I started traveling. I was able to take a 4-week solo road trip through the Deep South and Texas in 2014, and that's really when I started getting into photography more. I just fell in love with combining traveling and actually my guitar playing out at open mics in Nashville and in Houston, and doing photography. And I just had a zoom lens on my sister's camera, and I did a blog. So I had friends and family following this blog, and I would post photos and short articles during this 4-week trip, and everyone loved it. So that's really where I got hooked. I think of any of my creative outlets as being similar. They sort of come from similar places. In addition to playing guitar, I also do social partner dancing, like country two-step dancing and West Coast swing dancing, things like that. I also do creative writing, but the creative writing is primarily more blog-like. It will usually coincide with trips that I'm taking and the photography that I'm doing there. And as far as photography goes, you will just, in the same way that I know when I'm writing a good song, I know when the lyrics are flowing. If I'm, for example, in Vietnam and I'm in a market, these very colorful local markets, women who are selling either a lot of produce, very colorful produce, or colorful fabrics, I just suddenly see, wow, it's like one image after another I see in images. And it's the same feeling as songwriting, as if I'm coming up with a nice line that really works and the rhyming scheme works, it's compelling, it's interesting, I'll just say like wow to myself. One of my sons, I have 4 grown children, and one of my sons a number of years ago introduced me to Anthony Bourdain, the travel TV personality. And he's pretty edgy about things, but he did a number of episodes that took place in Vietnam. And that along with 1 or 2 other documentaries on Vietnam really piqued my interest. And I combined that with things I had learned about travel through, it was actually 2 of these long road trips that built my confidence. Because I've never been to Europe. I've been to Canada, I went to Mexico once, but I think of people's first major travel trip is usually going to Europe. My first trip was to Vietnam in spring of 2018. And the first trip I used a travel company combined with my own interest. They let me be flexible, and photography was the foundation of the whole trip. I just wanted to do photography. And by that time, I had my interest had narrowed. I hadn't narrowed it, but my interest had narrowed to street portrait photography primarily. And so I bought a nice portrait lens for my camera and had started using it already, and I just had the best time on this trip. People were so friendly. People would just come up to me and ask if they could have their photo taken with me. And so it's this combination of traveling and photography, cultural immersion, meeting a lot of people all over the country, just opened things up inside me as a person. And photography was kind of the foundation of that. And people really loved my photographing them as well, which is, I find it's very difficult here. You can't just walk around the streets of Hartford or Springfield and ask, oh, can I take your picture? But it's very different there. Before my trips to Vietnam, I didn't know how to use chopsticks. Even though, because of all my years of playing guitar, I have very good fine motor skills in my fingers. But I didn't know the physics of using chopsticks. And actually it was a Korean friend of mine actually helped to show me initially how to use chopsticks. And I practiced by going week after week to a Vietnamese restaurant and ordering the foods that are most difficult to eat with chopsticks, which to me are soups with slippery rice noodles. So if you can eat these soups and fish the noodles out of these soups with chopsticks, you'll be fine in places like Vietnam or anywhere in Southeast Asia. So my main interests in photography are street portrait photography and informal portraits, people I meet who will actually ask me, would you be willing to take some nice photos of me or of me and my friends? This has happened a number of times for me in Vietnam, where a guide or a couple of my guides will introduce me to friends of theirs, and they'll just ask me if I would be willing to do a portrait shoot of them, and it's, of course, there's just no question. I live for opportunities like that. And I'm an amateur photographer, as I said. I tend to learn mostly from seeing other people's work and thinking about my own work, and I'll usually get little hints, little cues, little clues that will bring me along, bring me a little bit further. Prior to my last trip to Vietnam, one of the things I had run into was on Netflix a series called Tales by Light, and each episode you are going with a photographer, basically on a trip somewhere, either underwater or to the Himalayas or wherever. And I haven't watched all of the episodes, but there was one in particular by the photographer. He's an amateur photographer. His name is Simon Lister, and he went to Bangladesh for UNICEF, on behalf of UNICEF, with the actor Orlando Bloom. And they went into some of the worst slums that you can imagine, primarily to photograph kids and kids' lives there. And I noticed one of the things that Simon Lister does was he would get in like really close to faces. And I had been timid about doing that in my own photography, but I set out for myself as that's one of the things that I wanted to try to do on my last trip in Vietnam, and it actually worked really well. And it usually took, you'd get to know someone and you would photograph them a little bit further distance, but I would gradually actually ask them, would it be okay if I could photograph you a little bit closer? And I found that those were some of the most compelling images. And you just get like with whatever your creative outlet is, you just are thrilled when you have an opportunity like that. So I just find it's just a gradual self-education. I'll try to do maybe one or two little new aspects to my photography on each trip. So if I had advice for someone who wanted to do travel and travel combined with photography, it's to stay open. It can be pretty scary the first time going to visit a culture that's so different from your own. And I just found that if I relaxed and opened up more, this whole new world would open up for me. And I incorporated photography in that. So I've taken 2 trips to Vietnam. The first was in the spring of 2018 for 2 weeks, and in the spring of 2019, a 3.5-week trip to Vietnam. And the photos from this exhibit are primarily from that second trip. And I've just continued to find that I open up further and further as a person, and that opens up doors to, in my case, be able to approach people more easily and photograph people on the street, in local markets, fish markets. I've just become friendlier, more open, more approachable. Another piece of advice is if you travel in a group or even as a couple, it can make it more, you are less approachable when you're traveling. So my travels have been solo so far. And even though I'm usually with a guide, I've gone solo, and people seem much more open either to approaching me or me approaching them. Okay, so included in this photography exhibit are some photos that I didn't take myself. And the reason for it, and I'll explain the reason, is because one of my guides invited me, arranged a visit to an elementary school in the city of Hue. Now, Hue is near the coast in central Vietnam, north of Da Nang, which is one of the major cities in Vietnam. And I had been interested in just visiting a school, meeting teachers. I'm not an educator or anything. I just thought it would be interesting to go to a school. I've seen this in documentaries where someone would just go and meet the kids and meet the students, and that seemed really interesting to me. And I thought I was going to be taking photos if I had the opportunity. I had no idea how to approach this, and so when I was visiting with this young woman, Lan, who in Hue, who I met on my first trip and was also one of my guides on my second trip, I mentioned it to Lan one evening when I was out with a group of Lan's friends and Lan. And I mentioned this interest in visiting a school. Well, Lan immediately started talking to one of her girlfriends who was with us, who happened to be a school teacher at an elementary school in Hue. So the next morning, I found myself as a special guest at an elementary school in Hue. And the kids were great, and I was treated like a rock star. And I was mobbed by kids so much that Lan had the presence of mind to take my camera and my cell phone from me and photograph the whole event, which is really interesting. So I can't take credit for any of those photos, but I want to give Lan full credit for having the presence of mind to capture a really interesting and special moment. So I was the accidental star in a promotional video for a motorbike tour company in Ho Chi Minh City on this last trip to Vietnam. There's a motorbike tour company there called XO Tours. All of the motorbike guides are young women who are either university students or recent university graduates. And this company promotes the well-being and futures of young women. And so I had taken tours, motorbike tours, with this company, both on my first and second trip. So I knew some of the guides from the first trip. And I asked the company before my second trip if they were planning any photography tours. I had never taken a photography tour. And I found out that they were developing one, but that it hadn't been offered publicly yet. But they invited me to take this tour as a solo guest, and they arrived at my hotel with my motorbike guide. Her name is Phang, P-H-U-N-G, and she happened to be one of my guides on my first trip to Vietnam. So this was a reunion for us. But Phang was accompanied by a video crew, and they asked if I would mind if they videoed this whole tour. It was a 4-hour tour going to 3 or 4 locations in Ho Chi Minh City. And I said, sure. So a promotional video that's being used now, and you can find it on YouTube. The tour's name is called Saigon Through the Lens. The company is XO Tours. And you can find this online, and I'm sort of famous in Vietnam now because of it.